Hey there. So I was just watching 12 Angry Men for the first time, which is like a movie that's commonly cited as being like a great example of like cinema. I feel like it's often used as a great example of like what cinema can be without falling into the cliches of what cinema typically is, where it's like you don't need a bunch of spectacle, you don't need a bunch of action, you don't need a huge budget to make a masterpiece, you know. You just need a good idea, a good script, good actors, that sort of thing. It was good. I enjoyed it quite a lot. Um, but I'm not here necessarily to talk about 12 Angry Men. Um, as a fan of sci-fi, I'm really into action and big budget spectacle. No, I mean, well, I am, but who isn't, right? Um, I was just making a joke there. But anyway, I I have had some ideas for like stories you could tell either in like a book or in a movie. Um, and I recently came up with kind of a new idea that kind of plays off some of the ideas that I've had before, but in kind of a new way, which I thought would be interesting to explore. But the problem is that the idea I have doesn't really make a good story on its own. Um, so I thought I would just make this video kind of rambling about what the idea is and maybe kind of brainstorm ideas that you could turn it into a story. I thought maybe that would be interesting. I just needed a topic for a ramble, so I figured it would work. Anyway, the idea is, and it plays off of, like I said, other ideas I've had in the past. So, I guess just to establish some lore, this would take place in like an alternate reality, an alternate universe where instead of the moon, Earth has another Earth, and it's like a binary planet system, right? Um, where the two planets are basically identical. So you just think two Earths. Obviously, they're not carbon copies of one another, but two Earth-like planets of relatively the same size. You know, that just makes, you know, if you were going to make it into a movie, that just makes filming it easier because then you don't have to worry about the other planet having like different gravity or something. You know, it's just more convenient. Doesn't make it less like realistic because the likelihood that you would have two almost identical planets that are both inhabitable orbiting each other. Obviously, that's like super, super rare. I mean, Earth-like planets on their own seem like they're very rare. So to have two would be really, really rare. But, you know, the universe is a big place. There's got to be at least one of those somewhere. Anyway, it's not important. The whole idea is that there's two Earths, which means that, you know, like colonizing the second planet doesn't require you to like terraform it. So like in our solar system, you know, the idea of like there being like moon bases or Mars bases and like terraforming Mars and stuff, it's been conceived, right? People have thought about that. It's made for interesting sci-fi ideas, but you know, that's a huge undertaking with tons of problems that you'd have to solve. If you had a planet that was already inhabitable, colonizing it would be pretty straightforward, right? Which is the whole idea. Anyway, so the concept, this idea that I had, and again, this isn't really a story idea. There isn't really much of a story here, which is the problem. It's like, how do I turn this into an interesting story? But the idea is this. So, if you're not aware, many of the countries in the world that we live in have signed and ratified, or whatever it's called, the Outer Space Treaty, which states that no sovereign nation can own territory on celestial bodies. So, no country can own a portion of the moon or Mars or any planet for that matter. Anything outside of the Earth is strictly off limits for any country to own. Now, to be fair, like I said, we live in a solar system where colonizing another celestial object in our solar system would be a huge undertaking, very expensive, and honestly, probably not really all that rewarding. So, arguably, if we lived in a solar system that did have another Earth-like planet that was easy to colonize, I'm sure very few of the countries that have signed the Outer Space Treaty would have done so, because it would have been like, hey, look, we can go take that over. As it stands right now, it seems like none of the countries really care, because it's like, well, there's nothing to take over, so who cares, right? But for the sake of this story, we are going to pretend that despite the presence of this other Earth-like planet, the countries of this Earth 2, this alternate reality Earth, have also signed a similar document, right? A similar treaty that says that no country can own territory on a celestial object. I like sci-fi, so this is taking place in what I would consider like our near future. I imagine we could do stuff like this within the next 100 to 200 years, but the idea is that the second Earth has become colonized, but because it can't be owned by countries, it's owned by corporations, because the Outer Space Treaty doesn't say anything about private corporations being unable to own land on celestial objects, so they would be allowed to. So what you would have is, a globe, a world owned by corporations, which would mean, there would be no necessary reason to, enforce or uphold like human rights and stuff like that. I'm imagining the second world would become this like hellhole of just like basically slave labor and stuff like that, right? Where people are subjugated to terrible conditions because there isn't a country there that has a reason to care about like their vested interests and their human rights and stuff like that, right? The idea is that the second Earth becomes really shitty. Nobody wants to live there. So here's where the idea comes in. The idea is that it's kind of like a metaphor for the world that we currently live in, where you have Earth, which has nations, has a precedent already set in place, right, to uphold human rights and whatnot. You can't just strip rights like that from people and expect things to go all right. The reason it works on the second planet is because it was born into a world that already had expectations of exploitation and stuff like that, right? And there's no obligation for that to, like I said, uphold human rights. The idea is that there's like some plot or some scheme put in place to try and like basically turn Earth, the original Earth, into kind of like an Elysium type of situation where it's like a world for the rich and the elite. And then the second world that has really shitty working conditions and, living conditions and stuff like that, becomes the place for the rest of humanity, right? Like I said, it's more of just a concept. It's more of just lore for like a sci-fi universe, so to speak, and not really much of a story. I don't know how you would make it into a compelling story. So like, my gut instinct would be to say to like have the main character slowly discover the plot over the course of the movie or the book or whatever, the work. But as for like, how to make that actually interesting, and like what would, because the stories have to follow like a certain structure. I mean, well, they don't have to, but they tend to, because this is just how good stories are told, right? There is a general structure to them. So I don't know exactly how you could rope this into a really compelling story. Um, and I don't know what the ultimate like resolution would be, right? Like what's the happy ending for this? I guess the happy ending would be not only that like the, because like the idea is that like either people are being killed or transported from the original Earth to the new Earth, right? Um, and that's obviously bad. So it's like it would be good for that to not happen. But I think ultimately the ultimate like happy ending to the story would be that somehow you would also end the suffering and the subjugation of people on the other planet as well. Um, but I don't know. I just thought it was interesting because it's like, because of the Outer Space Treaty, the nations that we rely on to provide people with laws and, you know, protection, right? Um, they would have absolutely no obligation to interfere in extraterrestrial activities. Because it's easy to think like, well, you know, if we imagine this happening, that like some country on Earth would get involved. Like you can't just let something like that happen. But it's like, well, why would they get involved? I mean, it's easy to hope that like people would be good and be able to see that bad things are happening. But again, the whole idea is that it's kind of like a metaphor for what happens in the real world. We have places in the real world that employ slave labor and shit like that, you know, with terrible working conditions and no human rights, right? Um, as an American, I guess I would see the metaphor of the story being that Earth, the original Earth in this case, represents kind of like America, and the second Earth would represent like third world countries and stuff like that. Um, Especially with what's been going on lately with, you know, like mass deportations and stuff like that, where it seems like the current administration is trying to kind of make uh, America into something that it never really was. Um, that's kind of what I would want to play into, where it's like they're trying to turn Earth into this playground, this utopia for the 1%, at the expense of everyone else. And they're willfully allowing that to occur to facilitate their own utopic experience, right? Because again, like I said, that's kind of what it feels like is happening in America to a degree. Obviously, it's nowhere near that extreme, but this is a story. It's a metaphor. It's supposed to be, you know, taken to an extreme, right? Um, but yeah, I don't know exactly how you would turn it into a really compelling story. Um, there's a couple different directions you could take it. You could have it to where the main character is someone that becomes subjugated and taken to the new planet, or maybe the main character is like a part of the 1%, and they're part of the people that would benefit from the whole situation, but then they either find out about it because they were unaware, or just suddenly have a change of heart and feel guilty about what's going on, and so they decide to try and stop it, maybe. Or maybe they're just like a random individual on Earth 1 that is completely unaware of what's going on. Because that's another thing that I guess I would want to touch on if I was really trying to make it like euphemistic to what's happening in the real world, which is that there's just so much noise that I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of every single thing that's happening. Even if, you know, it's being done by the people that, you know, they voted for and whatnot. If they don't know that it's happening, they can't object to it, even if they would, right? That's kind of the idea. So it's like, it would play into that by having it be where they're just a normal person that doesn't realize that it's happening, and then suddenly slowly discovers it over the course of the story, right? And tries to put a stop to it, or tries to raise awareness about it. I don't know. See, the problem is that when you make the main character like some random individual, it seems like they would have very little chance to actually affect something being systematically done by seemingly like every major nation on the earth, you know? But I don't know. Like I said, I'm not the best story creator, so I'm sure you could figure something out. But what makes a story actually interesting? Maybe I feel like I don't know if I've said this before, but I've thought this before. Maybe I've said it on this channel before, but I feel like the best movies or the best stories are ones where they're like a puzzle, where you don't fully understand everything right at first, and it becomes clearer as you watch and you kind of piece things together. I feel like a lot of movies and shows these days are so worried about people being lost and not understanding what's happening that they constantly explain themselves, and I feel like that kind of takes away a lot of the joy of watching those things, because, you know, there's no puzzle anymore. If you're presented with a puzzle that's already completed, it's like, okay, well, okay. It takes some of the fun out of it, right? So maybe, here's an idea. The story, the main character is a person that works for these governments or something, I don't know, as like a detention agent or something, you know. So they are personally facilitating this exodus to the new planet for these people, and maybe they've been lied to and told that the people that they are extraditing are, you know, criminals or whatever, and then they slowly uncover over the course of the story the truth that they're just normal people or whatever, you know. That actually wouldn't be too bad, I feel like, because then there's a precedent for them. They're not just a regular person. They are a regular person in the sense that, like, they are just one individual, but there's a precedent set that, like, they would have some amount of connection to other individuals who would be skilled enough to maybe form some sort of resistance. And there would be a precedent set for them to have the ability to even uncover the secret in the first place, versus a normal person who would seemingly not have that capability. Yeah, that's actually not terrible, I feel like. So they'd be like essentially like the Gestapo, sort of, where, you know, they're, you know, they're carrying out these acts, which at the beginning of the story they believe is for a good cause, but don't understand the true, like, root of the situation. and the true like motivations behind everything. Yeah, I feel like that could work. Um, it's been a long time since I took a class on like story structure, but I forget. There's like, I mean, not every single story has to abide to this like formula, right? But usually there's like, you have your hero and then you have like the goal that they want, and then they have to like reject the goal and then ultimately decide that they have what it takes or whatever, and then they achieve the goal, right? There's like a moment at which they like, it's like the call to adventure or something like that, and then they have to like reject the call. um I don't know. Like I said, I don't think it's that important that it abides so closely to the same formula as everything else that it you have to include those things, but still. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like that could work, but you do kind of run into the problem of like, well, at that point, you've kind of made your main character a shitty person, you know, if they're like a part of the fucking Gestapo. Um, is that someone you really want to root for? Um, I guess that could be kind of a secondary theme of the story, right? Is like the idea that people can change and that people are worthy of redemption and like a second chance, so to speak. It's tough because, like, while that is true, we are talking about some pretty heinous acts, and I don't know that every single thing a person can do is worthy of redemption and forgiveness. I think there are things you can do that cross the line. Um, so I don't know. I feel like you would potentially run the risk of making your main character a little hard to root for, or just simply hard to, forgive. Especially if there's like a happy ending for everyone. Or, well, see, that's the problem. It's like, I feel like the only way to make it feel compelling is for it to end with a happy ending for everyone. Because if like there's just a happy ending for like some people, including the main character, then it's like, oh well, sure, they got off. Um, but there's still all this suffering going on. The problem with that is that making a story with a happy ending for literally every single human being in existence is just really unreasonable, I feel like. Um, so maybe it's not possible. I don't know. Um, yeah, I don't know. I just, I'm sure there's a more skilled storyteller out there that could come up with something kind of interesting there. I just thought it was kind of a neat concept that kind of plays on, like I said, it's analogous and stuff like that, which I think is important. A lot of people will say like, oh, you shouldn't include, politics in storytelling, and you should just tell a story and not try to send a message or whatever. And it's like, well, that's kind of completely the point of like art is telling a message, right? So like, sorry, but you're just wrong. Um, that's not to say that every single message is going to be super compelling or super politically fueled or whatever, but that's what art is, right? I'm sorry if you don't enjoy that. The likelihood is that you just don't enjoy it because it doesn't agree with your personal views. you're probably more than willing to accept it when it is something that aligns with your views. But I digress. At the end of the day, art is a way to express the way one feels. And the way one feels often is fueled by things like politics and that sort of thing, because those are the things we care about as human beings. So that's just the way stories go. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's an interesting story you could tell there. You'd have to brainstorm it for longer than 15 minutes like I have, but I think you could do something interesting there. I don't know. I just thought that would be interesting. And it made for an interesting ramble. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. I forget if I said at the beginning, but I liked 12 Angry Men. It was a good movie. The moment where they start to convince, it's juror number 4, I think, about the glasses, and he's starting to realize, like, they're right. That was the moment. That was a really good moment. But yeah, it was a good movie. But anyway, yeah, thanks for watching, and I will catch you later. Bye.